All right, Jessica, take over.
Thank you so much, Mary, for that introduction. It's really lovely to be here and to see you all. I'm really excited to be in community with you and to share sort of what I've learned on my own journey toward incorporating anti-racism into what I teach. And I'm also really excited to learn from you all and to see how you are thinking about this topic in your own classes and in the content that you teach. So what I would like to do is I'm going to share my screen first. And I'm just going to give a disclaimer, is that I live near a train. So like if you hear a train, hopefully it won't be too loud, but if you hear a train, I'm not like at the train station or anything, I am at home. You know, Mary, I'm just realizing I can't see anyone's faces, which I guess is fine, but normally there's like a little window.
Maybe because you're sharing your screen, if you go to view and have it not be full view, you might see.
Okay. Oh, actually, this is okay. I see people over here to the
But we
left.
don't see your screen now.
Oh, you don't see my screen. Okay. Well, I thought I had learned a lot about Zoom. Apparently, I still have a lot to learn. So let me try that one more time.
We all do.
There. I really rely on seeing people's faces, but I can totally do it without seeing people's faces. That's fine. Okay.
I'll keep my eyes on their faces and I'll watch for the raising hands in the chats.
Thank you so much. There we go. Okay, and so you can see my screen, which is lovely. Okay, so first, I would just like to acknowledge that our campus, where I work at Kizer, but all of our campuses really are on the usurped ancestral indigenous tribal lands of the Tongva Nation. And so I just want to honor them and thank them for their constant and careful stewardship of this land. So I wanted us to say that first. So again, my name is Jessica, and I really am so glad to be here with you all because I think that we're all in a very similar place. We all care a lot about our students, and we really believe that everyone in our class deserves the same opportunity to learn. But we know that that's not always the case. And so the problem is that students do not receive the same opportunity to learn. The quality and their access to education really depends on the race and of the class of the family that they're raised in. And so by the time our students arrive to our classroom, they come with years of unequal academic preparation, unequal funding for college, unequal treatment by race, which means that they all do not have the same opportunity to learn. And many of these things are really beyond our direct control, but what we do have control over is our classrooms. And so we have the power to create a classroom environment that can help counteract these inequities. And by doing this, we can ensure that in our classes, all students have the same opportunity to learn, which will have consequences really for the rest of their lives. So by the end of the workshop, we're going to, hopefully we'll all be able to explain the sociological perspective, which is, I think, one of the most important concepts that I teach, and it's also one of the most important concepts that inform how I teach and how I be in this world, how I live in this world. We'll all be able to define racism and anti-racism, describe what anti-racist pedagogy is and what it looks like, and apply these ideas to how we teach our classes, and hopefully come away with one strategy or one way that we can incorporate that into our own classes moving forward. So as you guessed, and also as Mary said earlier, I am a sociologist, and again, like this is the most important, I think, concept that I teach, and it's this idea that enables us to grasp history and biography and the relations between the two. And so what this means is that our personal or individual experiences are shaped by social forces, but also that we as individuals shape our social worlds. And so what this sociological imagination, this concept.
Look, I've been trying for a while now, so I didn't forget today.
I hear some sweet, curious voices in the background. So having the sociological imagination allows us to see how history and societal events impact our personal lives and other people's lives. And so these events and forces that are outside of ourselves, they really can fundamentally shape who we are and the challenges that we face. And really, I feel that one of the main challenges to taking on this or understanding this concept is that many of us have like a very strong notion that like we are completely responsible for our fate. And one of the distinctions that Mills, who came up with this idea, makes is that there's a difference between like a private trouble, something that's only impacting me, and like a public issue that I want to talk a little bit about first. So I know that many of you don't know me, but my personal life has really dramatically changed in the past year. So, you know, now I work and I socialize from my laptop in my apartment in Claremont. I wear a mask outside. You know, I was eating a lot of ice cream. I was stressing a lot of ice cream. And so those are not just my individual personal troubles. The ice cream part is, right, but the other part, right, are not my individual personal troubles. And so what I'm experiencing really is much bigger than me, because the changes that have occurred in my life really have happened to millions of people, and for all of you, right, and have been out of our control. So the pandemic, right, is a public issue because it impacts everyone, and albeit in different ways. So the flip side of the sociological imagination, though, is that we as individuals shape our social worlds for better or for worse. So we have the power to engage in collective action, you know, to try to overturn election results, but we also have the power to demand rights for groups the government oppresses. And we also have the power to teach and empower students, like all of us do here. And that is also something that we have seen this year as well. And actually, since Kira is here, this is a little shout out to Kira. This is, if you remember, this happened in the fall, the Black Student Union wrote an address. And I believe that this was a collaboration with the Kizer art galleries, where they had this manifesto, 8 minutes and 46 seconds, where they had members of the community write a manifesto. And so this is an example of that here. So one way I take this idea of the sociological imagination to the classroom is by seeing students as whole people. When I was working on this workshop in the fall, I heard 2 separate people use this phrase in the same week when referring to their approach to teaching. So I kind of took it as a sign. And so the one person that said it was Barbara Junisby, who's here. So I really liked her term, so I'm using it here. So thanks, Barbara. So just as personal or individual experiences are shaped by social forces, students arrive in our class having been shaped by these forces. So students' race really fundamentally impacts the experiences they have and the opportunities that have been available to them. And by far, one of the most important opportunities that has been impacted is their access and the quality of their education, right? There are other characteristics that also impact students, but for the focuses of our discussion today, we're really going to focus on race and racism. And so I want to just talk a little bit about those 2 terms before we move on, because I feel like there's different levels of but different concepts, right? And so I want to share the one that I find the most useful. So one way to think about race or a racial group is a group of people who may share physical or cultural characteristics and may have a real or purported common ancestry or history. So like it may be real or imagined that we all have a common ancestry, but it's basically based on physical characteristics, right? And we also say that race is a social construction. And what that just means is that it's not based on biological differences. So really racial categories expand, contract, they change over time. Who gets to be inside one race is different at one time or another, right? And we give meaning to this idea through our daily interactions. And the other term I want to just talk a little bit about is this idea of racism. So I think a lot of us are familiar with the idea that it's a system of beliefs, that racial groups have different significant cultural or social differences within a hierarchy, and where in this belief system, subordinated races are believed to be inferior. And really racism persists because white people benefit from it and support it continuing. And I should say it's not just white people that benefit from it, but other groups of people too, right? Other racial groups that benefit from it as well and support continuing it. And I should say not all racial groups, right? But some, right? And the other point I want to make about racism, because this is sort of the individual perspective, is that like it's also a system, right? It's a system of oppression that's where these beliefs are embedded in these different areas or fabric of society. And really, racism is really ordinary, it's deeply ingrained, and it's a permanent part of Western society. And by permanent, I mean long lasting. And the way that this operates in the US is really through white supremacy. So white supremacy is this idea or logic that whites are superior, again, like whether you are aware of it or not, and it exists in the individual level, so in our own belief system, and also at the structural level. So when the beliefs are embedded into systems, right? And at the structural level, what happens is that whites receive material and symbolic advantages. So resources are distributed unequally based on race, where whites receive the most advantages, right? And that's this idea of white privilege. And again, like you don't have to be aware of it or not. Just like I don't have to believe in gravity for my butt, to stay firmly planted in the chair. Like I don't have to believe in like the essential nature of water for me to like reap the benefits of being well hydrated. People don't really have to be aware or to believe it for it to fundamentally impact them, right? So since we know that events and forces that are outside of ourselves can really fundamentally shape who we are and the challenges that we face, then this system that we live in, it really impacts how we define ourselves, what we do, and how we do it, including in the classroom as teachers. So actually, I just want to pause right here and just make sure if there's any questions I can answer. I can't really see the chat or hands. I just wanted to like check in and to see if there was any questions I could answer.
There's nothing in the chat and there's no hands raised currently.
Awesome, thank you, Mary. Thank you for being my eyes. Okay, so I think like this is fine what I just said, but I think I want to share with you a metaphor which I think is really helpful in solidifying this idea and also like making it make sense to what we do in the classroom. And this is this idea from Beverly Tatum, where she talks about the cycle of racism as a moving walkway. I mean, I haven't been to an airport in a long time, but I think they're called people movers, right? Where you're on them and they sort of move you forward in some sort of direction towards your flight. And so she thinks of actively racist behavior as moving quickly on the conveyor belt in the same direction that it's going in, right? So there's people that are out there that are, saying and doing things that are actively moving in the direction of racism, right? On the other hand, she talks about passively racist behavior. So passively racist behavior is doing nothing. It's not moving the conveyor belt forward, but it's also not doing anything. It's just sort of being stationary on this conveyor belt as it's moving along. In contrast, she calls anti-racist behavior moving in the opposite direction at a speed faster than the conveyor belt. So these are actions that move us away from the direction that the conveyor belt is moving us at a speed that's faster. And so we can see from this little graphic that like there is no non-racist category. The conveyor belt is moving all of us along. And so you can either move along with racism, you can like move quicker in that direction, or you can move against the direction of racism, right? And again, like it's not a state of being where like I'm moving against the direction of racism and so now I'm, anti-racist, but it's a practice, right, that we all have to engage in all the time. So we can change direction, we can stop moving entirely and just let ourselves be carried away. And so these are sort of three ways to be thinking about it. And so in our classrooms, since we know that the flip side of the sociological imagination is that we as individuals shape our social worlds, we can assess how we are moving, right, in this conveyor belt. And we can take this approach to how we teach. So are we creating an environment where all students have same opportunity to learn? Are we moving away in the opposite direction of the conveyor belt, or are we sort of teaching, like business as usual, right? Which might be considered passively racist. So we know in our system that Black, Indigenous, and students of color do not have the same opportunity to learn as white students. So these are from my 2 recent New York Times articles that basically schools are still separate and still unequal, right? We had Brown v. Board of the Education, but basically schools are just as racially segregated as they were then now. So we know that that is a reality. The other is that because schools are funded through property taxes, and whites have on average more wealth, right, which means that they're able to buy homes, right, and their homes are worth more, that non-white school districts get about 23 billion less than white districts, despite serving the same number of schools. So we know, just from national data, that not all students have the same opportunity to learn. But we really don't have to even go that far to even see this. So like there's students that live here that they go to school 7 miles away from each other, and they have fundamentally different school experiences. Their classrooms are different. Their schools have unequal resources, right? And so it's just not something that's happening nationally, but it's happening sort of in our own backyard, right? And in our own classrooms at the Claremont colleges. So teaching in a way that's moving in the direction against the conveyor belt, right, is anti-racist pedagogy. And so this is 2 quotes that I want to read that I thought was super helpful, but Blackney describes it as a paradigm to explain and counteract the persistence and impact of racism using praxis as its focus to promote social justice for the creation of a democratic society in every respect, which is like is a big definition, but it is a paradigm to basically understand and not only understand, but to counteract, right, to move in the opposite direction of the conveyor belt, the impact of racism and its persistence in our classrooms, and to do this using praxis, right, as a way to promote social justice so that we can have a more democratic society, so that everyone has access to knowledge and everyone has access to education. And it's also an approach that what it does is it reveals the structural inequalities within the US. It doesn't ignore it, right? It reveals it, acknowledges it, and it does this while fostering students' critical analysis skills, as well as their own critical self-reflection. So I teach classes about race, and some colleagues have told me, well, it's easy for you to do that in your class because it's a subject matter, or they'll say, or because like you're a woman of color, it's really easy for you to teach in an anti-racist way. And so I just wanted to say that like anyone can adopt this paradigm, right? And I kind of want to say what it's not, like anti-racist pedagogy, and this is from Kishimoto. She's saying it's not just about like simply just like slapping together some racial content in your courses, curriculum, or discipline, right? But really it's about how you teach, even in classes where race is not the subject matter. And like, I would guess the vast majority of classes at the Claremont colleges are not about race, right? So really, she says it begins with the faculty's awareness and self-reflection of their social position, and leads to the application of this analysis, not just in their teaching, but also in their discipline, research, and departmental, university, and community work. In other words, anti-racist pedagogy is an organizing effort for institutional and social change that is much broader than teaching in the classroom. So I just want to say that too, that like, not all faculty of color are teaching in an anti-racist way, and not all white faculty are not teaching in an anti-racist way, right? Anyone can adopt this strategy. It's a practice. It's something that we can all learn. And just because someone has a marginalized racial identity, it does not mean that they're necessarily teaching in an anti-racist way. It is absolutely possible to teach a class on race in a passively or actively racist way. People do it all the time, right? And the other point I want to make too about this quote is that it's not just what we do in the classroom, but it is a concerted effort that extends beyond the classroom. It's a concerted effort between different entities and different positions in our colleges that can create change. So it's everyone needs to sort of pitch in for this to work. So, these are our definitions. And so it'd be really helpful to know, like, well, what does that look like in a classroom? And so here are some, and this isn't an exhaustive list, but these are some of the things I'm going to focus on as different approaches to anti-racist, teaching. And I have notes on this slide, so that's why I'm gonna look here for a second. But part of the anti-racist approach to teaching is being continuously reflective about our own positionality. And part of that is like educating ourselves, right, about our history, the context in which we live, the context in which we teach, the context of our discipline, right? And how our own positionality impacts that. So that's like an ongoing process. Attending workshops like this, right, is part of that reflection. The other part, or another approach to anti-racist teaching is challenging assumptions of what knowledge is valued and who creates knowledge in a discipline. So really, anti-racist pedagogy, it really confronts positivist thinking and this idea that there is objective knowledge that just exists out there that is just waiting to be sort of found and learned, right? But rather takes the approach that we construct knowledge, right? That we determine which knowledge is more important, whose knowledge is more valuable than others. And the other part of an anti-racist approach to teaching is decentering authority and working to establish collaborative learning. So one is that anti-racist pedagogy challenges this idea that the professor is all-knowing and like distributes knowledge to everyone, but rather it seeks to empower students as learners and teachers who we learn from and teach, but also like they learn and teach. They teach and learn from us, right? That it's a more collaborative model of teaching. So it's kind of against these sort of what's called like sage on the stage sort of model, right? The other is that it links theory to practice. So the whole point of anti-racist pedagogy is to empower students with this knowledge, but also so they can go out and do something with it, right? So that they can use it to impact the world, to impact their own lives, right? But to create a more democratic society for all, right? If we go back to the earlier definition. Okay, so the first point about positionality I want to talk about first is that, just as, students are a whole people, professors are a whole people, too. So we have, here we go. We have different identities that impact our experiences and our opportunities and the things that like we learn. And so I think, and I don't know that we'll have time to talk about it today, but this is an important, I think a fundamental part actually of anti-racist pedagogy is really interrogating who you are, right? And how these different external forces impact you. And I want to encourage us to do this from like a curious place rather than a like guilt or like shame-based place. I feel like sometimes people feel if they realize that they have an identity that like that has more power, I think people tend to feel bad, and I don't know that's like a useful emotion for us. Like that's just I'm not a psychologist or anything, but that's like sort of my opinion. And so rather than sort of thinking about it as like this internal thing, as like I want us to think about it a little different. And so let me just show you this slide to clarify my thoughts. But right, is that we really need to understand how social forces shape us in a way that helps us understand structure. So this is a quote from Alan Johnson. He says, "Your privilege says less about you personally than it does about the society we all live in and how it is organized to assign privilege on the basis of a socially defined set of radical categories. The challenge facing us as an individual has more to do with how we participate in society as a recipient of racial privilege and how those choices oppose or support the system itself." So I think it's important to understand our own positionality, understand how these social forces impact us, but not in a way where we're focusing on ourselves personally, but rather in our position in a larger structure of power. And so I'll just give an example from myself. Earlier, I did a land acknowledgement, right? And that's because I'm a settler on colonized land. And I feel like this is gonna sound funny, but like I didn't fully like realize that until maybe like 3 years ago, where like I was thinking about like, oh yeah, like, you know, like there's people that like settled on land that you know that was stolen from indigenous people, and then they like settled here and they stayed here and they've taken, you know, and they've like oppressed like indigenous people. And so like whether I like it or not, right, I am a settler. And again, like this is not like a personal thing. Like this doesn't really say anything about me personally. It says more about my place in history, right, than it does about me, Jessica, as a person. And so the land acknowledgement, basically it's a formal statement, right, that recognizes and respects indigenous people as the traditional stewards of this land and the enduring relationship that exists between indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. And I think like importantly, what it also does, it acknowledges the history and my own place within it, and it acknowledges my own positionality as a settler on currently colonized land. And my other point was that like it also acknowledges like, hey, like that's not a thing of the past, but that is an ongoing thing that we're currently dealing with right now, where indigenous people are currently being oppressed, right? And so I would say like I feel like sometimes we think like, oh wait, like I have to transform like everything about my class, and I think that like really like making one small change is something that could be big, right? That like that acknowledging our own positionality or like tweaking one thing is a step in the right is a step in the right direction. Like we don't have to sort of like run a marathon and like change everything about our class, but starting with one sort of thing that we could do is like would be a great thing.
Jessica, we have a question.
Yes, I would love to answer
about the continuous reflection on our positionality.
Yes.
Asking, how do people who identify as privileged class, you know, white faculty, upper middle class faculty, those sorts of things, how do they do versions of this where it's authentic and doesn't feel performative or superficial, right? Like, do you do it all the time? Do you like, what are your thoughts on how to do that well?
I want to end my thing. I'm gonna go back to it, but I want to see what other people. Is that okay if am I going rogue?
No,
I want to
go
see
rogue,
what other.
Please. It's your show.
I'm curious to hear what other people. I think that's a great question, and I'm just curious to hear what other people think about that. I think that's a really important point.
I have a thought.
Oh, hi Bianca. Yeah, go for it.
Hi. I think more than anything is to be consistent. I think that's part of like not seeming like it's performative. I think consistency is probably something that like students can read and know and understand. And if we do like, for example, if we do a land acknowledgement, but then don't have like, I don't know, readings by and for indigenous folks, indigenous scholars, then like, okay, you acknowledge the land, but it's performative because I don't see it in your curriculum or in your class. So I don't know, that's just a thought, not saying that it's correct or anything, but just a thought.
No, thank you for, sorry, the trains. I don't know if you can hear the train, but what I hear you saying, Bianca, is that linking what you're saying to actually what you're doing in the class is really important. So we want to make sure that those match for us.
Yeah, and I think being consistent throughout, is I think really important. In the classroom, outside of the classroom, like when meeting with students. Yeah.
That's a great point. Any other thoughts that people have? I think it's that was a great question. I think also is that like, this is a process, right? And we try our best, right? And it's not always going to be received well, right? And so I think part of this is also being honest, is that like, hey, like this is something I'm working on. Like I'm trying to be very reflective about my positionality, this semester. And so these are things that I'm doing. I may make mistakes. I may totally get it wrong. And I hope that you will let me know if there's something I say or do that that like misses the mark. And I think just acknowledging that is really important, because we're all going to make mistakes. And it also models that for the students, right? That they don't have to be perfect and get everything right. I feel like sometimes the students can be kind of a little bit like harsh on each other when people say the wrong thing, right? And so I think it's just acknowledging your own humanity and your own fallibility is probably going to go a long way, because we all will say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing. And even if we do try to be genuine, not everyone's going to see it as being genuine, right? And so I think that's just also part of the process. Yes, and Stephanie, I totally agree, yes. And when you do make mistakes, yeah, taking ownership and responsibility, not just being like, oh, I'm just a person, but really to be like, to absolutely take ownership over that. Thank you for that. Any
Hi,
other?
Jessica.
Oh yeah.
Andre.
Oh.
So I think some of the things I'm thinking about is that I think it's kind of just double clicking on what Bianca was saying, that you want to make sure you're not only consistent, but you're consistent from the inside and the outside. Because I think sometimes the performative work is like cognitive justice. You're bringing awareness to the different histories of people of color, but then there's not like an internal awareness of how those histories have impacted you individually or also in your classrooms. So I'm just thinking about, like, as people of color or white people who have white supremacy ideology, how do you name that precisely, and how do you not toe around it so that you can really see and understand your own blind spots? But also having like a community where you feel safe, that's not like cancel culture where you make mistakes and people throw like digital stones at you. So those are just some of the thoughts I'm thinking about.
Yes, I mean, like only you know your intentions, right? So absolutely, like you should have integrity where your intentions should match your actions. And I mean, I think that's true I think that's true for everything. And so kind of what I'm hearing, I think from Andre and Bianca, is that like making sure, yeah, that your words and your actions match. Doing that work to sort of educate yourself about your own your own positionality and taking ownership over your mistakes. And yeah. Was there anything else that people wanted to add to that? I think this is like these are all great points. I was going to say this at the end, but like that's what I think this is one of the challenges of implementing this paradigm, is that some people are afraid to make mistakes, or they feel guilty, or they don't want to say something wrong, or they feel like students are going to take it well because they are white. And so I think these are all real challenges for sure, that prevent people or hinder people from doing the work. And also I just want to acknowledge it's also not easy. It's very uncomfortable. Like who wants to feel uncomfortable on like a day-to-day basis, right? So it's also kind of being okay with that discomfort and just acknowledging again, like that it is part of that process, and that's a normal emotion to feel. Okay. Are there any other questions I can answer before I go back to the previously scheduled programming? Okay, I love these questions, so like, please keep them coming. So let me go back to my PowerPoint. Okay. So yes, I'm a settler, very uncomfortable, right? But I am, right? And so I seem to own that, and just say that in class. So let me share my screen again. I also say too is that like being Black or being Puerto Rican doesn't prevent me from participating in the like oppression of other people either, right? And so like I also think that's important to acknowledge. It's not this binary thing where like there's oppressed people and there's non-oppressed people, but that like unfortunately like it is a system, right, that we participate in. Okay, I like really miss talking about this stuff. Okay, how do I go back? Oh, here we go. Miss share. Okay. So I'm a settler, don't really like it. I'm acknowledging it. Oh, okay. So how do we sort of do that? I mean, I think that's like that kind of is like another workshop, to be honest, but like, I think what people should do really is to really understand the societal context in which they form their identity, how these identities impact their beliefs, how they understand the world, and the opportunities that they receive. This may be for some people reading books. It may be for other people. I'll share this. So my dad this year, his goal is to become a critical race theorist. So like, he really wants to learn about critical race theory. And so like, basically I've given him like, or I've lent him a bunch of my books, right? And so he's doing all this work now about like trying to understand critical race theory. And so he's like really into it. And so like, that's his sort of thing that he's doing this year. I think what it's not is like asking, you know, other people to like educate you, but really you doing that work. I was going to go into this question, but maybe since we talked about it, I'll wait a little bit. Is there something in the chat, Mary? I saw like a little thing, but maybe.
It was just people loving your dad's goal.
Oh, I know. I know. Yeah, thank you. He'd be really happy that I mentioned him today. Okay. So I think one way to do this sort of like concretely is to really think about your own discipline, right? I know some people are like historians in this group. I don't know everyone in the group, but some people are like in computer science, right? But I think these are questions that we can all answer that would help us sort of make shifts in how we are thinking about the course content. So an anti-racist approach, right, to thinking about course content is to really understanding how the discipline was developed and what was the context in which these theories, these research methods or paradigms became legitimized. And so remember, the anti-racist pedagogy really pushes back, right, and confronts is like, who gets to decide what kind of knowledge is legitimate, right? Like, why is it that some people's knowledge is considered, I'm having trouble with this word, legitimate, and others aren't? I'm like a recovering stutterer, and it always comes out when I'm like a little bit nervous. But that is like a really important question, right? Is that like, how did this knowledge get formed? What was the role of the discipline, right, within these dominant ideologies of US society? Who was involved in creating it and, you know, in perpetuating it? Who has access to these disciplines and who's benefited? Who was excluded from the discipline? And why do they lack access to it? What are they not, like, why are they, oh, this question is, what are they not benefiting from? So when students when there are voices that are silent in your class, meaning in terms of the course content, when we're not including that knowledge, what are students losing, right, when we don't have those voices? So I actually have an example of this, and I think one of the people is here, and I hope I'm pronouncing their name right. I heard about this, and I thought this was like super fantastic. So it was Pomona professors Janice Hudgens, I'm so sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, and Jorge Moreno created this decolonizing physics and astronomy symposium, which was like really, really cool. So basically what they argue, and this is what am I saying? What they wrote basically is that their canon, right, of physics and astronomy, it mainly consists of the contributions of white men, of European or North American descent. And so they use an example from this physics textbooks that like a lot of people use. And basically what they find is that like in the first like 6.5 chapters that they use in this class, not a single work by a woman or person of color is even mentioned, right? And so they go on and they highlight how the work of women and other marginalized groups of racial groups are absent from this textbook that lots of people use, right? And so what they do is they not only connect the absence of those voices in the content of their class and in the content of the discipline, but they connect that absence to the low representation of both women and BIPOC students in the field, right? So they're not just like, oh, hey, look, like these voices are missing, let's just add in a bunch of more, but like the fact that these voices are missing in our field means that students aren't actually getting a complete like education of physics and astronomy, but actually the fact that they're missing is directly related to their underrepresentation in the field. And so I don't know how long this has been going on now. I think maybe a couple of years, but this is like a really wonderful example two scholars who are not teaching race ethnicity, but are absolutely using an anti-racist pedagogy approach, right? In deconstructing whose knowledge is valuable and whose knowledge, is missing from these conversations, and how is that related to the people that are studying these disciplines. So I just wanted, again, I like this example a lot because I feel, again, people are like, well, you teach race, it's super easy because that's the content. And I'm like, you don't have to study race. Like you could literally just in any discipline. So I think Janice is here, and I don't know if Janice I wants to speak more about this symposium, but I thought that it was really wonderful.
Thank you. This is incredibly flattering. I did not expect to see myself featured in this presentation. Maybe instead of me saying something, I'll sort of invite questions.
Yes, I would love
like
that.
to hear more about this.
Yeah, I'll go rogue again.
But I also don't want to derail your talk, so please jump in.
I think what was I gonna say? I think that if people have questions about, well, I'm gonna have people start thinking for this for their own discipline, but if people have questions for Janice, we could totally do that right now as well. Can I ask you a question? Maybe I'll ask you a question, Janice. Is like, how did this come into being?
It was sort of a two-part thing. It actually started because I was teaching a community partnership course in the spring and asking students to do some readings, sort of understanding our community partners. And Tomas Summers Sandoval challenged me on whether the physics majors actually had the background to understand these readings we were doing about the experiences, in particular of young women of color in public education in the US. And I thought about Tomas's challenge for a bit and realized I maybe did need to rewind. And so I added some curriculum to the fall, where we spend the first half of the semester really going through the definitions of things like what is implicit bias, what is structural racism, what is white supremacy, and how do those things apply to physics for the first half of the semester. And then the second half of the semester, these projects where I ask students to take that knowledge and find a way of making the department more inclusive or more equitable, like to take a piece of what we've talked about that interests them and try and work on it, because I'm trying to give them some agency with this as well. So I started doing that in 2015, maybe. And then a couple years later, Jorge joined our department, and Jorge was like, you know what, we can do better than this. We're gonna make it into a big symposium, and we're gonna invite people, and this is gonna become a big thing. So it was Jorge who sort of took it up a notch from there.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. And one thing I love too about your story is like the collaboration, right? It's like the conversations that you were having with different people that were also informing sort of how you were thinking about your own class. And so, yeah, I really love that example. Thank you. I realized this one for a second. So I have one more example, and then I want to have us do something. So let me share my screen again. Oop, this is not the right one. This is. Here we go. Okay. So I just have one more. Actually, maybe I'll skip this example for now because I would like for us to think about our own classes. Is to think about our own disciplines, right? And about the big ideas in our field and the dominant thinkers in our fields, right? Are there any that you just know that like are often not taught or cited in research, right? Like what's valuable about the work? How can you incorporate them into your reading list based on these reflections? And also like what impact do you think that would have? So actually I just asked you a lot of questions, which I know I'm not supposed to do, but maybe we can just answer one, which is sort of like, are there any, like what voices are silent in your discipline that you don't have in your syllabus or that are not, part of the canon of your fields? Like, maybe we can put in the chat, like, in my fields, like, I'll give an example from my field is that a very important, like, I guess, like parent of sociology is W.E.B. Du Bois, and like people don't teach his work in theory classes at all. I didn't learn his work, and when I was in grad school in theory, he was completely absent, right? And actually it wasn't just like an accident, he was excluded on purpose from the discipline, right? And so now people are trying to sort of think about how to incorporate his work into their classes. And so that's something I'm also thinking about, because I didn't have that as part of my own education, right? But if you can put in the chat, like, what are the voices that aren't being heard in your field? I would love to know that. Oh, I can't see the chat. Okay. Indigenous voices, Paula, Shelva. Absolutely. I would say that like this is true in my field as well. Absolutely. Okay, we only have so I think we have 40 minutes. Okay, so I'm gonna let's think about that, because it also is kind of a hard question to answer, right? It's like, who's missing? If you don't know who's missing, it's kind of hard to answer. But in the museum studies, lack of indigenous and people of color, absolutely in museum studies. Yeah. Jessica Tinklenberg, in my field of religious studies, deference is given to Western European press at men. We neglect the global South and indigenous voices. In writing center work, there is a huge lack of Asian, especially Asian women. Absolutely. So I think even having that awareness or asking ourselves those questions is an important part of our development, right? Is to even notice who's not in the room. Because once we notice that, then we can make changes in our curriculum or in our content. But if we're not asking those questions in the first place, right? I think to Janice, to Janice's point, it was someone else asked them, like, are they really getting are students really getting the education that you think that they're actually getting, right? Like, are the people that you're missing out on in this field? And I think that's an important question for all of us to ask ourselves. Okay, so I want to give one more example, because I think this is important too, is that, oops. Here we go. It's this idea of linking theory to practice, right? So Professor Gemma Lornett is also, well, she's my colleague at Pitzer, but we both teach statistics. She teaches it like a math person. I teach it as a social science person. But one thing I really loved about her class that she did recently was that she completely redesigned her intro to stats class. So I had given her this book, or I told her about this book. It's W.E.B. Du Bois's Data Portraits, Visualizing Black America. And basically what he did is, he's an activist and a writer and a sociologist and a historian. But basically what he did was he created a number of graphs and charts and data visualizations to illustrate the color line, right? And to illustrate Black life, which you can see here. And they're very beautiful, they're hand-drawn. And basically they were missing, they weren't missing, but no one had seen them basically, we didn't really use them. And recently these editors put together all these graphs and released it as a book. And so I just shared it with her. And so she was like, I'm gonna make this into my class. I was like, okay, cool. So basically what she did was she completely revised her class to directly address racial bias and social movements and racial justice. So sometimes in these classes, and I've done this too, we have students analyze kind of fake data or a survey or whatever as an exercise. But what she really wanted to do was really link what they were learning to practice so that they could understand the social world, but also tell other people about the world as well. So they all focus on issues of racial bias or racial justice, and they were using statistics and data visualization to analyze election issues. And then what she did was she made a website with student work, which is really cool, which I think I can show you here. Hopefully this is it. Oh, it went somewhere else. Let me hear it. Where she put all of the students' visualizations up so you can see them. So they really came out really cool, actually. So this is voter turnout in New Jersey based on unemployment rates, right? And they're all modeled after the data visualizations that we saw, or that they saw in the Du Bois book, which was really cool. And I'll just show you sort of one more that was hand-drawn. So this is record voter turnout in Vermont. So this is, oh, it's maple. Like, oh, I get it, because they have maple syrup. Okay, so like maple syrup, but like really it's about Vermont voters and what percentage voted, right? So really like creative ways to show data, right? In a way that was using knowledge that had been sort of excluded and ignored by scholars, and really brought it into the forefront. But also she linked what they were doing to things they actually cared about. And they weren't just sort of like, and again, like I've totally done this in my class where like you have people like analyze sort of issues that don't really matter just for the sake of the exercise. But really, she really wanted them to have knowledge about the statistics, but also link it to things that matter to them. Okay, so I'm gonna have one more slide and then I'm gonna ask us all to do something. Okay, so like this is really important, and it's really important for symbolic power and for like giving students a rigorous education. So when we incorporate marginalized voices or voices that have been excluded, right? Really what it does, it expands all students' conception of who creates knowledge. So it elevates BIPOC people as the intellectual authorities that they deserve to be. And it really allows BIPOC students to see themselves in positions of power. And to be frank, it allows white students to see BIPOC people in those elevated positions, like as creating knowledge, right? And the other thing I think it does is it allows, it helps us to see BIPOC people doing research about their own communities, rather than like white scholars doing research about marginalized communities as though they are a problem, right? And so when we do this, it allows BIPOC students to see themselves in a position of power, right? But it also gives everyone a more rigorous education because we are expanding all conceptions of who creates knowledge and also providing knowledge that we don't necessarily like hear from, right? So again, it benefits actually all students. So I'm going to, oops, not yet. I have another thing, but what I would like us to do sort of is to, let me stop sharing. Oops. Look, I'm always going rogue. Okay, what I would like us to do is if we're thinking about maybe our syllabi for like a class that we teach a lot, right? What is like one thing that we could change about the content, right? Or one thing that we can incorporate into our classes. And if you're like, you know, I don't even know where to start, maybe that one thing is to like ask somebody, what are some resources or what are some, you know, readings that have been neglected, right? Or that are not considered legitimate in my field because of the scholar's, you know, race, right? So maybe we can take like maybe like 3 minutes. I would love to see in the chat like what are some sort of ideas that people have to make this sort of like one small change. Because again, like it doesn't have to be like transforming your entire class, but it literally can be, I'm going to have a whole unit next semester on this one thing. And then you build off that change the following, you know, class, right? But what sort of one thing that you could do? We're thinking about the content in our classes and how do we incorporate those voices that are missing in our content. Oh, Ben wrote, the most commonly used computer programming languages, the means of digital, yes, the means of digital production are designed by white male English speakers. I love that idea. But yeah, the means of digital production, I didn't think about that. I will share one thing that I'm thinking about doing. Actually, I'll wait. In biology, when I bring in experiments data from published papers, I can try to highlight a more diverse range of researchers. Yeah, absolutely. Wait, did you mean, you meant published, right?
Yeah, that's just my typo.
Okay, I just want to make sure it wasn't like another word that looks really similar. I'm gonna wait for like one more. I have a slide deck of BIPOC chemists and introduce one to students each week. That's so cool, Mary. That's really cool. I wish I had taken your chemistry class when I was in school.
The really cool thing is that I did it with my colleagues, and I got the slide deck from a conference I went to specifically about highlighting BIPOC STEM practitioners. But we made a front slide that specifically states we know that our department is white and the representation is important and that we really want to help students. And so we created, so like we made a statement together as chemists. So every week they see that statement telling them why we're doing it, and then they get to learn about a new scientist, and then we talk about it a little bit. And the students, it was one of the biggest things in our evals, was how much they really appreciated that every week there was somebody new to learn about, even if the context, it didn't fit the content of that week or whatever. It was just like, and they span generations, so they could see we've been ignoring important contributions for a really long time. It's not just like all of a sudden there's new people of color doing science. They've been doing it all along.
Yeah. That's awesome. And Kira wrote, my art history course begins with conceptual art practices in the 60s. This era is bereft of women and artists of color, which needs substantial revision. Yeah. And I think too, like, is that, I think too, like, as people do that, it becomes like normal. It's not like a, how do I say this? I feel like sometimes we're like, oh, this is like a diversity unit, right? Or whatever, but really, like, we eventually want it to be integrated into like the curriculum as like a normal, ordinary thing, right? I think like that's like sort of the goal. Shelva, I change the content of my classes to show how psychological constructs do not always generalize to non-Euro contexts. Thank you, Shelva, that's so important. So understanding how we need to define psychological constructs in a culturally sensitive way. Absolutely, right? I love this. Okay. Oh, Ben, rather than tell students that programming language such as, I don't know what that is. Let's do an assignment where, it's just a symbol. Okay, let's do an assignment where we write programs in da 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 da. Oh, very cool. Okay. Oh, in org studies, instead of having lots of readings critiquing white supremacy culture in our orgs and stopping there, last semester I started to include works by Indigenous, Black, and women organizational practitioners on how they have re-envisioned and recreated powerful organizational alternatives. Absolutely, that's awesome. Because it's like, yes, we want to critique, but also just like, well, we want to also hear what other people have to say rather than just the critique, right? So like, I love that. Okay. Let me go back to my PowerPoint. This is like so great. Okay. I didn't, I have to reshare my screen, huh? Let me do this. There we go. Okay. I have an example from Barbara, but I think I'm going to skip it. Sorry, Barbara, just in the interest of time. What's it called? The other part of the anti-racist pedagogy is decentering authority. Oops, that's not what I want to do. I want to do this. It's decentering authority, right? Where like this professor has like all the power and they're just like sharing it to all the students. And so back when Elizabeth Warren was running for president, maybe a couple of years ago, I heard this podcast that was sharing her approach as a teacher in the classroom and how she was really thoughtful about equal access, and it really stuck with me. And so this is from the podcast, but this is from one of her students. So they interviewed her previous students about this. So he said, in the run-up to exams, when people came to her office with questions, she made everyone write up those questions and send them to her. Then she wrote up her answers and sent them back to the entire class. Because if one person has a question, it probably means that a lot of people have had the same question, and it was very important to her that people were not going to have any structural advantage because they were the kind of person who knew to come to talk to a professor in office hours. And I remember listening to this and I was like, oh my gosh, that's so true. Like, how many questions am I missing? Because one, people don't feel comfortable coming to office hours, or they don't know that that's a question to ask. And I'm answering a bunch of questions for some students and not other students. And so basically, I'm not really giving students equal access, right, to me as I guess as a professor, but also I'm only like sharing some things with some students and not others just because they asked. And so I remember thinking about this, like, wow, like how do I decenter myself, right, as like the authority that can answer all the questions and make it so that we all are learners, right? But also like if one person has a question, everyone gets the answers, kind of whether they wanted to get the answer or not. So I remember really thinking about this, and I think I had a conversation with 2 people, and I can't remember one name. She was in Keck and she was really great, and I'm losing her name, but the other was Gemma, and they were telling me about Piazza. And I remember I was like, this is so great. And so basically what Piazza is, it's like a forum where students can post questions like as themselves or anonymously, and anyone can answer them. So so again, like in the anti-racist, pedagogy approach, the professor does not have a monopoly on knowledge, right? But remember, we're decentering authority and we're making it so we're in a collaborative learning environment, right? Where we all have something to learn, we all have something to teach. And we're trying to provide this space for collaborative learning. And so I implemented this in the fall, and it really worked very nicely. Not everyone enjoyed it, but I think it did what it was supposed to, which was to share information with everyone. So I'm going to show you a screenshot of what it looked like, but basically students can post questions. And so you can see here that an anonymous person posted, when doing a Chicago style citation, does the first or last name come first? Because I'm getting 2 different answers from the website. So I would be like, oh, that's a great question. I would just
Jessica?
like kind of click. Yes.
Can you make it full screen? I don't think people can read.
Oh.
I'm seeing that people can't see the.
Okay. Oops. Let me go back. That's strange. Let me try again. Is this? Oops. Let's try again. You stop teaching and then you forget all about Zoom, how it works. Is this better?
No, it's cut off.
Okay. Well,
maybe the way you had it, it's fine. We'll do our best.
Okay, I will describe what I'm reading. Well, basically, it's a forum where people can ask questions anonymously or with their name, and anyone in the class can answer. So here, someone's asking about a Chicago style citation, about does first or last name come first? I'm not the only person that can answer that question, right? Like there's anyone in the class can answer that question, right? And so somebody did answer it, and they were not anonymous. And the student answered a bunch of questions, and they were great. And so they answered the question, and then I also endorsed the answer. So I can endorse the answer. I can think it's a good question, but basically students are learning from each other. They're asking questions, and students are teaching each other. And the other thing is that everyone gets access to the question and the answer. So it's not like what I was doing in the past, where someone would ask me a question, I would only answer them. But really, I think that it helped really democratize, I guess, the space, so that everyone was able to learn in a more equal environment than what I was doing before, right? And so I think that's something that we can be thinking about in our own classes. Can you all see this one, or is this the same issue?
I think it's the same, but if you read it, then we can see.
So strange. Okay, well, basically, thinking about our own classes, sort of, what are some ways that we can do this in our own class, right? Or actually, how are you already doing this in your class, right? Because some people may already be doing this, which I would love to hear about too. But thinking about what aspects of our class have barriers, right, that are preventing some students from having access, and what are some ways that we can break down these barriers, right? This is something to be thinking about. Okay, so I'm gonna start to end, actually, because I also want to have a discussion and to talk about stuff, and I also realize that you all can't see my slides. So let me just, you know what I'll do, actually, Mary? I'm gonna just try stop sharing one more time, and I'm gonna share one more time and see if that helps.
We can see them, but they weren't in presentation mode, so it just wasn't big. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. So I'll try one more time. I'm gonna share my screen. And then I will, can you see this?
Yes. but it's in regular, it's like in edit mode, not in presentation mode.
That's so weird.
But we can
Okay,
still
well,
see it.
okay.
Oh, there it is. Now,
Okay, awesome. So I also just want to acknowledge too is that like professors are whole people, right? That we all have, that we have caregiving responsibilities and health challenges and financial challenges, right? And so I also want to acknowledge that too, that like, that these are really difficult times, right? And teaching already is a challenge, right? Especially when we're doing it virtually, people are exhausted, there's burnout, right? And really what I'm sort of advocating and what you all are trying to do, like teaching in an anti-racist way, it really is radical work, right? And so I wanted just to share this quote by Jamila Pitts, because she says, to teach well is an act of selflessness, to engage in education in a way that leads to liberation, disruption, joy, and resistance is radical work. And in our current social and political climate, the work that we are doing is political. But if we cannot do the work because we are burnt out, because we are tired, irritable, or hungry, because we are stretched too thin, because we are sick and afraid, then we cease to be our most powerful selves. And to engage in the work that we have been called to, we must be our most powerful selves. So again, I just want to say, like, this is like what we're doing is, it is hard work, even in the best of times, and even teaching normally is very difficult. And so to teach in an anti-racist way really is radical work. And so I also want to acknowledge that as well. So I have a couple of questions just sort of thinking about ourselves and sort of moving forward is like, as part of anti-racist teaching really is replenishing yourself so that you can teach in that way. That you really can't teach well, you can't teach in an anti-racist way if you also are not taking care of yourself, right? And so I also want to acknowledge that that is part of it, is that doing this kind of work means that we need to ensure that, right? That we're doing the stuff that we can rest and recover. And so, and again, because like this is also helping professions, not just like we're doing something that helps, that like that there's an emotional element to it as well. And so like maybe that means that like you don't respond to some emails right away, right? Or you don't work every weekend or every evening, or you grade some assignments a bit slower, right? Or you like don't go to that meeting that you don't really need to be at, right? Or you don't prepare for every single meeting, right? But that like, because teaching is important, right? And because like the kind of teaching that we're trying to do is really important, how can we sort of maybe lower our standards in some areas that would allow us to do that? And I also want to acknowledge too is that like implementing anti-racist pedagogy is not easy. Like there are challenges. So one, at some places, there's a lack of institutional commitment. I will say like I was, I don't feel like that's the case at the CTO. It's so wonderful that, that they've invested in all this programming, right? And in this workshop, but like in some instances, there isn't a lot of institutional commitment, right? The other is that like, there may be challenges in terms of tenure and scholarship where not everyone values, right, this kind of teaching, right? Or maybe it's not seen as like a legitimate part of teaching, right? Or maybe it's seen as sort of extra. The other is like this internal struggle with whiteness, which someone, asked about earlier, is that like people are afraid of making mistakes, or they feel guilty, or they feel like it's sort of, it's too much to do, right? And so like those are also real things that really prevent people or challenges people in implementing anti-racist pedagogy. And so I wanted just to emphasize, that it is a learning opportunity for both students and faculty, and that the process is the most important, right? Like not necessarily that like we made an anti-racist class, but that we're engaging in that process and we're making changes to our classes. And just acknowledging that we are going to make mistakes, and that's a normal part of that process. And just to Stephanie's point, to Bianca and Andre's point earlier, is that like making sure that we acknowledge our mistakes and apologize for them when they come up, but also to make sure that what we're saying is in line with what we're doing, that our values are in line with the actual class, that we're not saying one thing and doing another thing in our class. And again, it doesn't have to be like a whole transformational thing where like my entire, fall class is going to be different, but like making one change would be awesome. Like making one small change that you could implement in your classes that would take an anti-racist approach would be moving right in the direction against that conveyor belt. And the other point that I want to make too is because I'm an assistant professor I'm on the racial justice initiative with Barbara and someone else. And so I've been thinking about sort of the role of anti-racist pedagogy at institutions. And so, Kishimoto, she writes that that this approach really isn't effective when it's incorporated beyond just the classroom teaching. So yes, it's important in our classroom, but it really needs to be part of all these other aspects of our work life. It needs to be part of our department, the research in our discipline and interaction and work in our colleges, right? So it shouldn't just stop in terms of oh, I'm gonna add this one article about racial diversity in this area, but really it's a practice that we live out in other aspects of our work life, right? So I just want to say too is that so remember we don't have control over the external environment that impact our students' ability to learn and receive the education that they deserve. Really, the only thing that we have control over is the climate that we create in our classrooms. And if you have tenure, or if you are a dean or something else, you have control over, or at least influence over the climate you create in your college, right? And so we can structure our class and we can show up to our classes to teach by implementing anti-racist pedagogy in our classes. And by doing that, we can get closer to ensuring that every student has the same opportunity to learn. So I just want to say too, the workshop doesn't end here. This isn't an hour and a half of our lives. This really is our life's work for a lot of us. And so this process is going to continue. And so there's so much wisdom in this group. And so if there's any resources or questions that you have, I hope that we can do that now and share resources or ask questions and have a discussion now. But I really am really grateful to have shared the space with you and to I'm able to learn and to share what I've been learning as well. So thank you. So I'm going to end the show. I'm going to come back to you all.
Thank you so much, Jessica. That was amazing. And I'm excited that there's 15 minutes for people to ask questions and have comments and share their own awesomeness.
Yeah. And also to share resources too, right? If there's something that you're I've been using this in my class and it's been working out really great, I would love to see that as well.
Well, I have one in the chat that I can go to. Let me get there. Hang on, I lost it. Oh, there we go. What are some techniques and strategies to help when people are hyper aware of racism? Maybe you feel so strongly that you want to be inclusive that somehow you might be treating your BIPOC students differently relative to your more privileged students. So is this a case of too much of a good thing can be bad, or what is some advice people have?
I think I want to make sure I understand the question. So the person is so aware of racism that they...
Hi, Mary, this is my question. So thank you, Mary. Sometimes I wonder if, because I'm too hyper aware of racism, I am a brown person, but I also acknowledge that, I grew up privileged. And so when I'm interacting with students, I sometimes wonder if my desire to be so strongly inclusive and to, bring inclusivity for my BIPOC students, I sometimes wonder if I'm, being more of a resource to them than I am to my other students. Does that make sense?
Are you worried? So I'm going to ask this. So are you worried that you're treating your BIPOC students better than your white students?
Yes. And then that's why I'm wondering, is too much of a good thing bad here? Is that in itself creating, I'm thinking of these, I'm wondering if because of, the rhetoric that's been happening, I've been overthinking things, but, I feel like I've become so hyper aware of racism and my actions and how, I'm constantly reflecting on how I'm treating students, that I wonder if I'm creating disparities between my students when I'm trying to be inclusive. I'm trying to, not be racist. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And so, I think I want to take a step back and think about the structure, right? Again, like in terms of there are systems in place, right, that privilege white students and white people like over BIPOC students and BIPOC people. I don't know, Jamie, that you are that powerful enough to, and I mean this with respect, to reallocate all these resources in a way that is depriving white students of their right to an education. So, and I just want to say, like, I love that you're aware of racism. I don't know that there's a hyper awareness. I feel like that seems like a healthy amount of awareness. And so I mean, I'm curious to hear what other people think, but I think if we think about the structure that we're in, I just don't know that you're able to overcome hundreds of years of inherited advantage. You know what I mean? Or like, I just don't know that you're able to like redistribute it in an unfair way in your classes, if that makes sense.
Yes, that does make sense. Thank you.
I think that's a really great question, though, that I'm sure other people are probably thinking about, is like, how do I treat students, like fairly, or in a way that's like equal, or like just sort of being mindful of that. I think that's a great thing to be thinking about. But does anybody read?
I'll
go
share
ahead,
something
Mary.
on that, just because I think it's an interesting story. I'm hyper aware of being a scientist, and that we don't have a great, our field is not wonderful, as Janice has shown, for being inclusive and for helping students of color be successful. And so in studying, like, so we've developed a different course, and I wanted to see how that was working and to see what retention numbers were looking like. And we don't have to go into those details, but what came from that, from the registrar, was, wow, like, you've completely closed the gap for your students of color in that first semester of chemistry. That's fantastic. What are you going to do for the, I don't want to use the word they used, the wealthy white men who actually are doing the worst in our Gen Chem class? And it was like, well, clearly there needs to be an intervention. And I had this very weird, like, I don't need to have an intervention for them. I'm sorry, like that. I'm sorry they're not doing well. And then, so reading the literature, it's because they have such a big safety net that they can risk not doing well in that first semester, and it doesn't alter their entire future. So sure, maybe there needs to be some education about, hey, maybe you don't take those risks. But it was funny that the response from the registrar's data was, well, the people who are really not doing well in your class are these very wealthy white men from elite liberal arts or elite high schools. And I was like, I'm not going to develop a course for that. So I really do think I can't do too much for my students of color. It's not because we are doing better for our students of color that these white males aren't doing well. If you read the literature, that's sort of a constant thing of people who have a lot of privilege take a lot of risk. And sometimes that means party more, or don't care if they get C's, or because they know it's going to be okay. And that's just a different growing up piece. That's not, so I don't feel the need to do less for my students of color, even though they're doing better as a group right now than some other cohort, if that makes any sense.
It does make sense. And just I feel like the opposite point of what I said earlier too, is that like that what Mary's doing in your class is like amazing and wonderful, and like that we do have the power, right, to help like alleviate, right, racial disparities in our classes, but we also don't have the power to undo, again, like hundreds of years of disadvantage and ongoing advantage either, right? So I guess the idea of like being too nice, I don't know that, not too nice, but I guess like I guess it's one to just sort of to differentiate between our own individual efforts, right, and like structure and patterns that have been going on for hundreds of years. They're related, but like they're not equally matched, if that makes sense. Dan shared in the chat, people are interested in Indigenous land acknowledgements. A link there. Thank you. That's super helpful if people are interested in reading more about that. Are there any questions or like things that people wanted to share about their classes or things that they're sort of thinking about?
I think it's been great how many questions and comments you've posted in the chat. I just have to say kudos to everybody. I know that we're all zoomed out. So Jessica, kudos to you. This was having 32 people show up for a workshop in the middle of Zoom semester is amazing. And to all of you for the participation, the interest, the value you place on this. I think it's great. And I feel really good about our community that we all care this much and are devoting this much time. And I think we should spend a little time just clapping our hands for Jessica. You can do that out loud or, in one of those little boxes, but this was really fantastic. And it was so wonderful of you to come off of your sabbatical and come visit us on Zoom again and spend time with us to share your expertise.
Of course, thank you so much. I really appreciated everyone being here. So thank you. All right.
All right, well, I'll leave it open in case people want to throw out some last minute chats, but I wanted to be sure we got a chance to congratulate you and thank you before people needed to run out.
Thank you, Jessica. That was
Thank you,
wonderful.
Barbara.
Thank you so much.
Just absolutely fantastic,
Bye,
Jessica. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Bye, Jessica.
Amazing.
Bye.
Hi, Mary.
Okay. Was it
Jessica,
okay? I feel
phenomenal.
like I didn't have enough internet.
Oh my gosh.
It was so
It was
good.
freaking
Oh,
brilliant.
okay.
Like I texted Mary in the middle and said, "This is the
She
best.
did.
It is so fantastic. It is
Okay,
exactly
good.
what I need."
I was
Oh
like,
my
maybe I
God.
didn't have enough internet. I was like, maybe I don't have enough activities, but then I was like, I'm okay.
It was so good.
No, but they spoke up and they wrote in the
Okay.
thing.
Yep.
And, a couple people sent me their private questions that I could share. And I wonder, because you had so many really beautiful and important quotes, would you also
Yes,
share your slide
of course,
deck
yeah.
and send out the video and the slides to everybody? Because some of those were just inspirational and I'd love to look at them more regularly. And then others are ones I want to use. And I imagine I'm not the only one. So I'd love to be able to share those slides.
Yeah, absolutely.
That'd be incredible. Yeah, it was great. Just top notch.